screen. All right. Good afternoon, everybody. So we've got two separate cases investigations we're going to talk about. The first one is an internal investigation that's resulted in criminal charges against one of our child protection investigators. Her current name is Taylor Martin. She was recently married. Until recently, we hired her as Taylor Johnson, but I'll refer to her as Taylor Martin throughout my remarks. This is very similar, unfortunately, to a situation, if you all were here or recall, about, I guess, a year ago. We had a child protection investigator that was falsifying records and falsifying the results of investigations. And he was criminally charged and terminated as well. So this situation began in August when one of our child protection investigation supervisors was completing a file review and found a report entry that Martin had made concerning what we call a collateral neighbor investigation. So a collateral neighbor investigation is we have an allegation of abuse, abandonment, and neglect. One of our child protection investigators is doing that investigation at a particular home. But one of the things we want to do in doing due diligence and doing a thorough investigation is to check with the neighbors to see what they may know, what they may have heard, what they may see, what their observations generally are, and whether they know the people, and whether it helps us to determine whether there's any merit to the allegations. And again, it's just being thorough in an investigation. It's required in all of the child protection investigations. So the supervisor found that the report entry by Martin was questionable because the notes were not comprehensive and they seemed generic and very different than what Martin had authored in the past. She was also running up against report deadlines, and it appeared that she was cutting corners in her reports. So the supervisors notified, or the supervisor notified her supervisor that she felt that the entries were suspicious and that Martin may have falsified these reports. The report entry in question initially documented that Martin had contact with a neighbor of somebody who she was investigating with that allegation of abuse, abandonment, neglect, the typical child protection investigation. Again, these are all called neighbor collaterals, and they are a standard part of a CPI investigation. So the supervisors that the supervisor of Martin had this reported to them, a sergeant and a lieutenant who are assigned to our Child Protection Investigation Division, went to the neighbor's home and asked them whether they had been interviewed by Martin during the course of her investigation or anybody else from CPID. And these neighbors said that they had not been interviewed. So at that time, we were aware we had a problem. Martin began a several-week vacation, so we really couldn't fully interview her. There was some communication and some dialogue with her while she was on vacation, but again, we really couldn't fully interview her during this multi-week investigation. But in the interim, supervisors reviewed all of her other cases for the previous 6 months and determined that there were other questionable report entries regarding these neighbor collaterals that she was supposed to do. They contacted two additional residents in two different cases where Martin documented these interviews, and she had claimed that she conducted these interviews, but it was determined that she had not. When Martin came back from vacation earlier this week, she was confronted with the fact that she had documented the required interviews, but the people that she supposedly interviewed denied that that had happened. When she was pressed about it, though, she began making inconsistent statements and finally admitted that she was lying. She admitted that she had falsified the records and justified it by stating that she was overwhelmed, that she had been making up the interview results because she had, quote, too many tasks to complete. So as we look at what she was falsifying and justifying these reports, Martin stated that the neighbor in one of these cases was a friend of the mother who she was investigating, and that she, quote, assumed, self-servingly, that the neighbor would simply make positive comments about the mother And so she put in her report what she, quote, believed that this neighbor would say without actually interviewing the neighbor. So Martin provided these false details to support her findings in the case, including that the family under investigation has several extended family members who come to the home, and that the neighbor had, quote, no concerns that the neighbor who was under investigation had any conduct that she should be concerned about. So she also falsely reported no concerns about drug or alcohol use. The neighbor was also unaware of any domestic violence. So on the flip side, when supervisors actually conducted interviews with that neighbor, they found that the woman actually did have concerns with the person who was under investigation and believed that there was drug dealing occurring and that, quote, shady people were coming and going from the residence. So she has an investigation. She doesn't talk to the neighbor. She reports in her report that the neighbor has no concerns. She believes because, or assumes that because they're friends, that she's gonna have positive things to say. So she makes up specifics. And those specifics that she makes up about no concern about drug dealing, people coming and going, et cetera, turn out to be false, because when the neighbor is actually interviewed, is that they say that there are shady things going on and there are drug dealers coming and going, and there is a concern. So in another case, Martin documented she spoke with a neighbor who said that they had no concerns for the children next door, and he denied ever hearing any noises or concerns about domestic violence. So that's what Martin puts in the report without having ever talked to the person. But when the neighbor was actually interviewed by the supervisors from Child Protection, he said that he had heard domestic arguments next door, so it was contrary to what she said. In the third case, Martin documented that a neighbor, quote, denied any concerns for the neighbor children and had no recent concerns about the mother's alcohol abuse. Again, when supervisors interviewed the neighbor, she expressed the opposite. She had concerns about the children's care by the mother because, quote, the children run the streets and the mother is, quote, intoxicated all the time. The neighbor believed that the children also had not been adequately supervised. So Martin was arrested this morning. She was charged with 3 felony counts of falsifying records in a child protection case. She's been terminated from the Pinellas County Sheriff's Office, and she was booked into the county jail this afternoon. All of the cases that Martin was involved in have been reinvestigated. No children were harmed, and no children are in harm's way because of Martin's false reports and really an utter failure to do her job. As we did with the last one, and hopefully this will be the last one, and we'll never have another one of these, but we're going to go back to every single one of her cases, and we'll do an audit of those cases just to make sure and review all of them. But we've reviewed the most recent ones to make sure that there are no kids that are in harm's way, but nothing has developed and given us any indication that any kid was in jeopardy because of this, and we've gone back again and done these interviews. So if anybody has any questions on that one, I'll take them now, and then we'll move on to the other one. Trevor, go ahead.
Cases are you going to have to go back on, and what happened to this particular case where you found the actual false interviews?
Yeah, they've gone back and done the investigation on it. They're following up on it. And it'll become part of the active investigation that's ongoing. But there doesn't seem to be anything that would be changing the outcome of it. So again, there was no harm to any kids. It really didn't substantially alter the determinations that were made. But we're going to continue to look into these. Now, our child protection investigators carry an average, roughly, of somewhere around 15 open cases at a time. So they're not carrying an inordinate amount, and that amount, we monitor it very, very closely. And it's consistent with the standards that the Child Welfare League of America promulgates for the number of open cases. And we try and keep that somewhere in the 12, 15, start getting up there 16, 17 range. And our child protection investigators are within acceptable case ranges. There are some around the state that are much higher than that. It's something we're very aware of, and I can tell you that she was not overwhelmed. She didn't have too many cases, and that they were absolutely within the acceptable parameters as to the number of cases she had. She just chose to cut corners and not do her job, and whether it was leading up to this 3-week vacation she was taking or for a whole host of other reasons. She was interviewed after she was arrested. She acknowledged that what she had done, she admitted it, and just maintained the same statement that she was overwhelmed and not doing her job. If she was overwhelmed and not doing her job because she felt like she couldn't handle it, she needed to come to her supervisor, and of course we would have given her the resources so that we could help her succeed. But this, of course, is unacceptable and not the way to handle the situation.
Sure. So if she had said falsely that these neighbors or whatever didn't have concerns, and it turns out they did have serious concerns about kids running wild, intoxication, drug dealing, parents, people coming and going, and how can you confidently say that no kids were in danger if she totally mischaracterized?
Well, it's hard because I have to be very careful in this because everything regarding these child protection investigations is confidential. And I have to be very careful about it. But I can tell you that from looking at the files and looking at what was done, and the action that was taken was the appropriate action of the circumstances. And the fact that we didn't have, or what was initially thought to be what one neighbor said, did not drive the outcome of the case.
These cases may have turned out to be okay, and that's obviously fortunate, but that may not have been the case. I imagine that's something that's going through your mind.
Oh, absolutely. And it could have. I mean, there could have been something there that was very crucial and it was outcome determinative, and it did change the course or change a decision or determination because of what was said or not said. And that's why it's so important they be done. And that's why it's a requirement to do a thorough investigation, to have that due diligence, and to talk to people who are in a position to know. So a next door neighbor who sees all the comings and goings and can hear things and has observations. So, it is. I think we're just very lucky, frankly, that there wasn't something bad that happened from her. And of course, we're still looking at it and we're still investigating it, and it's fair to raise the question. Are these falsities and these false reports and these false narratives in the reports limited to just the collateral neighbor investigations? Is there something else false that she put in those things? Of course, we're looking at all that. So far, we haven't come up with anything. But, all of that's on the table, and it's all a fair observation. And it is very concerning because by not doing her job, she very easily could have put kids in harm's way.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, you said this started back in August, but how long has she been employed with you, with the sheriff's office?
Yeah, she started here April 29th of 2016, so 3 years, a little more than 3 years.
So are you guys looking back to the very beginning?
We'll go through everyone. Now, when they start with us, they go through initially what's called pre-service training. So they're in training for a period of time, and then they're very closely supervised in the equivalent of a field training program. And by the time they get to what's called full rotation and they have a full caseload, et cetera, it's a period of time. So, she started with us in April of 16, but a lot of that is training time and ramp-up time. So it's probably only a couple of years or so that she was on full rotation and had, cases. But just like we did with the other one, it's the right thing to do. We're going to go back and look at every single one of them. Some of them are hard because the people we're investigating, a lot of times when you go back a significant period of time, they're not around anymore. Some of them are transient, et cetera. But we'll make that effort and go back and make sure we review it and dot every I and cross every T and look at it. And again, the last thing we want. Now, if it's been a period of time, go back a couple of years, chances are that situations have evolved and changed. And but if we found out that something changes and there was some harm because of it, we'll look at it, we'll reevaluate it, and we'll put something else out on it. But of course, we hope that's not the case.
How much weight does an interview with these neighbors carry in this entire investigation, knowing that there are a lot of facets to it?
Yeah, and I think it varies, Trevor, from case to case and situation to situation. But I'd say that, certainly it's not insignificant. Because those people, again, are in the best position. They're there and they see the goings on, and their level of familiarity with the neighbor is unknown until you actually go ask the questions and determine. I mean, we know that. I mean, some neighbors are very close with others, and some don't even know them at all. But they certainly have, and you can see, and just in these three cases, is that where she erroneously, wrongly, falsely, and lied, and reported that these people didn't have any knowledge or what they saw was favorable. And then when you actually go and do the inquiry and you ask the questions and do your job, is that you find out it's the opposite. Now, some of it's more significant than others, and some were like, well, I really don't know them, but I've seen things and it's shady and it's a problem. And other, no, I have more familiarity, and these kids are running around, they're unsupervised, she's a drunk, and I'm really concerned about the kids roaming the streets. So I would say that, there's definitely significance to it, and it's an important part of the investigation. Is it, paramount. I don't know if I go that far, but it's definitely significant.
Sir, easy question and a slightly more complicated one. Where did she go on vacation?
She left because she was getting married and she was on a honeymoon. Where she went, I don't know. Didn't ask.
And second question here. So this is now the second CPI who's been accused of this sort of thing. And even if the standards for caseload are within whatever, industry standards,
Right.
Is there like a more underlying problem with the CPI program here that's accounting for all this?
I don't think so. It's no other indications that anybody else is doing it. But after the last one, we did put certain processes and procedures in place for oversight, and we do have quality control checks that are in place. And I think that what's good about a very bad situation is the fact that we caught it ourselves and it was detected during the review process and the oversight processes that we put in place. So, as they say, you can't fix stupid. And how in the world would you think that somebody, when this just happened and somebody else falsified records and they get fired and they get criminally charged, and then she turns around and does it herself? It's inexplicable. You can't explain it. It's stupid. But there's certainly no indication that there is a greater problem or a culture problem. I can tell you that the amount of supervision, the amount of oversight is the highest you'll find in any child protection operation in the state. And we have a lot of quality people who do a great job that are very dedicated to what they do. And like with any organization of any size, and this is a big one where you got almost 3,000 employees, you're going to have this type of stuff that happens from time to time. The fact that we've had two of these, I would say that, maybe some of it is because we are on it and we are overseeing what the people are doing, and we self-detected it. So, but there's no indication. Again, it's a fair question, but there's no indication that there's a greater problem. And if there is, I'll tell you about it. And we'll continue to make sure that we have the right accountability measures in place, we have the right oversight in place, and that we're scrutinizing all of this, and these people are very closely supervised. Nate, from looking at all the metrics, and I get a report, I look at the metrics every month, the Pinellas County Sheriff's Office Child Protection Investigation Division, which is one of 7 sheriffs in the state that do it in lieu of DCF, consistently every month is at the top of the leaderboard and the top of the metrics as far as compliance with all the requirements. So I think we're in a good place. It's unfortunate that these things happen, and it's unfortunate that we had 2 of them. So.
How many of these officers do you have?
So in the Child Protection Investigation Division itself, there's about 140 employees in the division, and roughly about 80 are child protection investigators. And again, we're one of 7 sheriff's offices in the state. So at Manatee, Pinellas, Hillsborough, Pasco, Broward, Seminole, and Walton are the 7 sheriff's offices that DCF does not operate in those counties to conduct allegations of abuse, abandonment, neglect. Contrary to sometimes what the media says is that DCF said, well, it's not DCF in those 7 counties, not DCF here, it's the sheriff's office. So DCF does not operate in these 7 counties to conduct these investigations. The sheriff's office is statutorily the provider of those services. Now, we work under
What's that? The whole process. I know we dealt with this with Jordan Beliveau.
Yeah. Right, and I think in that case in Jordan, I think, some were saying, well, in DCF, but remember that case is different, because in that case, we were involved in it, but our role, and just so that we're all clear with this, and I'll just say it again, is that our role is on the front end. Our role is when a complaint is made and it goes to the hotline, the DCF hotline, then they send it down for investigation. Our responsibility is to go out and conduct that initial investigation on abuse, abandonment, neglect, and make a determination, one, is it substantiated or is it not? And if it is, what's the appropriate remedy or what's the appropriate thing to do to make sure the kid's safe? And the hardest decision that our child protection investigators have to make is that, and that is whether to remove the kid. And if we remove the child, then the preferred response there is some sort of familial placement with somebody else, a family member someplace else. But when that doesn't happen, and it happens, but then we put them in foster care, and they go in the foster care system, and that's where they go to the community-based care provider, which is Eckerd, and it goes down that path. Or the other choice is that you leave them and with some sort of a safety plan and services, and you hope that you made the right decision and nothing bad happens. So it's a very tight line and sometimes a tight rope to walk. It's a very tough job, and they have to make very tough decisions every day. All right, anybody have anything else on that one? Okay. All right, the next one's a case that was investigated by our homicide unit. On May 9th of this year, 35-year-old John LaPointe lived at the Crossroads ALF and Group Home located at 11928 85th Avenue North in Seminole. Joshua Russell was an employee of the group home. LaPointe was 35 years old, but he had Down syndrome, and as a result, had a cognitive ability of about a 1-year-old. He was nonverbal, and he was unable to care for himself. At about 5:30 p.m. on May 9th, deputies responded to the area of 82nd Avenue east of Oakhurst Road in Seminole to a call of an unresponsive male who was in a vehicle. The vehicle turned out to be a van that was owned by the group home where Mr. LaPointe lived. The unresponsive person in that van was John LaPointe. When deputies got there, paramedics had already arrived and had determined that LaPointe was deceased. Deputies learned that the driver of the vehicle, who was Russell, had left the area on foot and that he had a gun with him. Deputies located Russell nearby. He did have a gun with him and told deputies that he was going to kill himself because of what he had done. Detectives determined that Russell had driven LaPointe to a doctor's office at about 1 o'clock that afternoon. They both left after the doctor's appointment. They left about 1:40, but before returning LaPointe to the group home, Russell decided to stop at his own house, which is located at 13864 Bermuda Drive in Seminole. Russell left Mr. LaPointe in the van seat in the back, and he was seat belted in when he went into his house. When Russell went into the home, he told detectives that he, quote, parachuted 2 packages of kratom by wrapping the powdered kratom in toilet paper and swallowing the kratom. Russell claimed that he used kratom to, quote, feel awake and alert. He then went back to the van, got in, and his intention was to drive off and to return Mr. LaPointe to the group home. But as he left the house and began driving down the street, Russell said he felt nauseous and tired from the kratom that he had just ingested. So he decided to return to his residence. He parked the van in the driveway, and he said that the van had poor air conditioning and that if he left it running, that he would overheat. So Russell turned the vehicle off. Russell put the driver's seat where he was seated back into a recline position and decided to take a nap. He woke up, he said, between 2 and 3 hours later, and the van was extremely hot and he was covered in sweat. He then immediately saw Mr. LaPointe slumped over in his seat and not breathing. Now remember, Mr. LaPointe's 35 years old, but he's nonverbal, can't care for himself, and has the cognitive ability of a 1-year-old. So as he was sitting in there and that van got extremely hot, and there was nothing he could do. He couldn't try and wake up Russell. He couldn't do anything to help himself. So Russell claims when he saw LaPointe slumped over, he was drenched in sweat, that he unsuccessfully attempted to perform CPR, and then when there was no successful resuscitation, he went back into his house and he got a gun because he was going to kill himself. Russell then called his mother, Jody, who is also a Crossroads employee, told her what had happened and that he was going to kill himself. Jody Russell convinced her son not to kill himself, and while they were talking on the phone, Joshua Russell began to drive to where he thought his mother was with the deceased Mr. LaPointe still in the van. Jody convinced Joshua to pull over and wait for her to get where he was, and that's why he pulled over in the area of 82nd Avenue and Oakhurst Road, which again is where I started, which is where we got called to, but that's how we ended up there. When Jody Russell got there, she called 911. Upon subsequent interviews at the scene, Russell stated that he had been falling asleep a lot because he was coming off, quote unquote, of kratom. He said that the withdrawal symptoms had caused him to become very sleepy, and because of that, he had recently taken several days off from work. That day, Russell was arrested by detectives for carrying a concealed firearm. He was booked into the county jail. On May 10th, which is the next day, an autopsy was performed by the Pinellas Pasco medical examiner, and the investigation has been ongoing since then, including waiting for the medical examiner to issue a report on the autopsy and determine the manner of death. During the investigation, detectives conducted a temperature test by recreating the situation in the van under light conditions on that day, and that they estimate the temperature inside the van when Mr. LaPointe died was about 125 degrees. The medical examiner recently determined that Mr. LaPointe's cause of death was hyperthermia, overheating. Russell was arrested this morning and charged with 1 count of aggravated manslaughter. He was booked into the Pinellas County Jail on a $50,000 bond. One of the concerns that I have in this, in addition to the obvious, is what we're seeing out there these days as far as some of these substances are concerned that people say that we shouldn't be concerned about. You know, kratom is not a controlled substance. It is a plant material that comes from the east. It is plant material that is not controlled. DEA tried to make it a controlled substance in 2016. A whole bunch of people pushed back, lost their minds, and said, oh no, don't do it, because all it is a plant material that makes everybody feel good. So we're coming into a day and an era in this country and in this state where we have a whole bunch of people using a whole bunch of stuff, including CBD now and other products. And you know, just because these products are legal, and some are likely to become legal in the future that are not now, people got to think about what they're doing and how they're doing it. And even with a thing like kratom that is highly debatable, it's an opioid derivative. People use it to eliminate pain, but it does make you drowsy. It does cause people to be sleepy. It does have effects, and just like others do, just like CBD does and these other things. And if people are going to be driving down the road and be able to walk into a store and buy all these hemp derivatives and all these CBD products, and people can buy kratom and get stuff over the internet and everything else they're doing, it doesn't eliminate the obligation to do it in a responsible way. And that's one of the greatest concerns I have. You know, alcohol's been illegal for a long time, forever, and people don't use that responsibly. Now we're adding all this other stuff out there, and you got a guy who ingests and parachutes 2 big packages of kratom. And how he said he did this is he took the packages of kratom in a powder form. And you can ingest kratom in a number of forms. One of the ways, it's not usual, but you can smoke it. But there's a whole bunch of ways to ingest it. And how he parachuted it is he took the packages of powder, he wrapped it in toilet paper and swallowed them. So he took 2 big doses of it, and that's why he felt the ill effects, pretty much immediately as he was leaving his house. Because after he took it, he took his dog out for a walk, and then he went out to the car, and then he drove off and got sick and came back and fell asleep for 2 to 3 hours. And look at the results. So this is, there's a lesson here, again, beyond the obvious, especially when you're a caregiver for somebody who has a disability, who has Down syndrome, who can't function, is nonverbal. You got a real heavy obligation to that person. But beside that is that don't be running around using kratom or any of these other drugs. And people who are using these things thinking, oh, I can just use them, they're legal, they need to think twice about it.
2 questions. Can you spell Mr. LaPointe's name? And then, does he have any family in the area?
I'm not aware whether he does or not. It's Lapointe.
No E at the end?
No, there's an E at the end.
There is a T-E.
That was John.
John, yeah.
Is that J-O-H-N?
Yes.
Probably a mugshot online for it.
What's that?
Mugshot online, most likely.
Well, John LaPointe's the victim. Joshua Russell is the defendant, suspect. 35?
He's 35 also?
Somewhere in that range. We can get you all that information. I'll get you a photograph of him.
So basically, he forgot about him?
Well, no, he didn't forget about him. Is that he takes the kratom, gets all messed up, gets sick, feeling nauseous, tired, comes back, realizes that he can't drive, and he's got Mr. LaPointe sitting in the back there, who is this 35-year-old guy who's, again, nonverbal, can't care for himself, has the cognitive ability of a 1-year-old who's belted into the seat behind him, and he turns off the car, turns off the air conditioning, and puts the seat back and recline to take a nap, and he says that's what he's going to do is take a nap. Well, it's 2 to 3 hours later, and look, let's just call it what it is. This poor guy baked in that car. I mean, that's what happened. You can call it whatever you want. You can put niceties on it and call it hyperthermia, but this poor guy baked, and that's what it is, and that's not good.
Is it kind of surprising that Joshua himself didn't suffer more injuries?
Yeah, I don't know. I can't, all the physiological things and, the kratom and everything else, why, but some of it too is maybe that's what caused him to wake up, and maybe Mr. LaPointe, because of his situation and condition, and I don't know, all his physical ailments, but he was to a doctor that day, is that maybe he just didn't have in the physical condition and shape to last as long. And I mean, think about what that guy went through. He was awake, and he's sitting there, and this guy lays down, and he, I'm sure he had to suffer. You're sitting there, and you're hot, and you're boiling, and eventually you pass out. And he baked, and that's what it came down to. And then so he passed out, and he died. And the secondary cause was some aspiration as well. So it's terrible. And with Russell, I don't know. I will be, but maybe that's why he woke up because he could care for himself and he could wake up and realize, oh my God, there's a problem here before he stopped breathing. But this guy stops breathing, but he couldn't communicate. It had to be absolutely horrific in that car for that man.
Would you like to see regulation of kratom and some of the other things that are out there?
It's a mixed bag, Peter, on that. It is a plant material. It is very mixed. And when you do the research on it and you go out there and you look at it, I know that there was a couple of state representatives a couple of years ago that filed bills that tried to push for the regulation, if you will, or to make kratom controlled substances in Florida, and it was pushed back on hard. The DEA, the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration, they tried to make it a controlled substance, and they got all kinds of flack for it. Because there was so much pushback, they abandoned it. Because it is mixed, and the research is mixed, and the articles are mixed. I mean, you can go out there and research it, and you have well-respected medical institutions like the Mayo Clinic that call it junk and trash. I mean, you can go Google it, and you'll see that. And you have others that swear by it and say, no, it relieves pain, and it's better than using opioids and Oxycontin and oxycodone. There is pain relief, and it also, some people say that it helps them who use these opioids like the fentanyls and the oxys, et cetera, that it helps them wean off of that. So I think it's just a very mixed bag, and some of the stuff isn't going back the other way, and in fact there's going to be more, I predict, more of these substances that become uncontrolled. And we're seeing it now with, what was a complete ban on all THC products, which is the component of the cannabis plant that makes you high. So now you got a threshold in Florida where if it's below a certain threshold of 0.3%, then it's in the hemp category and it is not illegal. And then you got stuff that's above that is. So you can have a whole bunch of products. You can go down here on Seminole Boulevard, go down here on Ulmerton Road, and walk into these stores where you're buying these gummies, and you're buying the oils, and you're buying all the other stuff, and you can buy a jar of green plant material that looks like, smells like everything of traditional marijuana, but they say that it's 0.3% or less, which makes it legal. And some of these things, then when they get processed, is that when they get processed, the THC count actually goes up, and that does have a euphoric effect. So my point of all that is that these things become more prevalent and more people are using them, I do have a concern that you're going to see more consequences like this because people aren't doing it in a responsible way. And when people say, oh, well, it's no big deal, it's just, it's just CBD, it's just marijuana, it's just kratom, it's just this, bad consequences. You have to do it responsibly. I mean, you can have bad consequences, of course, with alcohol, too. But there's a whole bunch more people. The more stuff you have, and the more prevalent it is, and in higher quantities it's being used, and you end up with these, then you got more of an opportunity for bad situations like this. So, I'm not, calling for a change going back because I don't think it's ever going to happen. And in fact, I see us going the other way. But what I'm calling for is people to realize that the license to use it isn't a license to do stupid stuff like this. And it's not a license to disregard your obligation and to act in a responsible way to people that especially you have a caregiver relationship over. And whether you're a parent and a kid or a guy like this with a disabled adult or just driving a car. It's amazing how deputies stop people and their driving is so impaired and they are driving in such a dangerous way. And when they get arrested, they say, well, I have a prescription for that drug that I was taking that made me this way. Seriously? Is that, well, I wasn't drinking. It doesn't matter. Is that it's still driving under the influence of a controlled substance to the extent that your normal faculties are impaired. And people think they mistake me just because they got a prescription for oxy or they got a prescription for whatever it is. Oh, that gives me a license to do whatever I want. No, it doesn't. But that's what we're seeing, I think what we're seeing here, and I think people mix that up just because they can go to the store and buy it, that it's a free reign to do whatever they want and however they want, and that's a huge mistake.
Do we know how long Joshua was the assistant for it, or was the aide to John LaPointe?
I don't have that information. I know he worked there at this group home, and I don't know how long he was there or how long. And I know his mother, Joshua's mother, Jody, she worked there also. And if you need it, we can get with PIO and try and give you that information. I don't, off the top of my head, I don't know that.
Sheriff, you already kind of described it a bit, but can you go into a little bit about what kratom is?
Yeah, so it's a plant material. It's an opiate-based plant material that is primarily grown in the Far East, and it is imported into the United States, and it is used in a variety of forms. I say probably the most common form is the powder form, but it can also, the leaves, because it is a plant material, it can also be smoked, and it has a number of ways that it can be consumed. People buy it. You can buy it in stores. You can buy it over the internet. Very easy to access, and it's pretty prevalent out there. All right. Yep, go ahead.
There was a third story that we got a news release.
A third story.
A news release concerning someone posing as a deputy with the trying to extort money from people, saying that they're under investigation or sort of. Can you talk a little bit?
Yeah, Trevor, I don't have much on that because I was busy with other things today and prepared for this. I did see it. This does come up periodically where we do have people that pose as a member of law enforcement, a member of the sheriff's office. We'll get this where people will call up and say, I'm Lieutenant so-and-so or Captain so-and-so. Your grandson has been arrested. You need to send $5,000 and get him out of jail. Or a whole bunch of different scams. They'll call up and ask for money. Is that, say they represent a fraternal part of law enforcement or policing, like the FOP or the PBA, and I'm, Sergeant so-and-so, and so you get a lot of that. People need to be very careful about it. Well, the thing I would say to people is you'll never get a situation where a member of law enforcement is calling and telling you to wire money, send money, deposit cash, or anything along those lines. It's not going to happen. And people should be very, very aware and not respond to anything like that. Be absolutely leery of it. You're not going to get a call like that from law enforcement. So it's something to be very concerned about.
Sheriff, there was a fourth story.
The fifth one, too.
But seriously, Deputy Sibley, what he did to stop the car that was driving down. Can you talk about that a little bit, what happened in that case?
Yeah, and Travis Sibley is a good deputy, did a great job, and, at least arguably saved some people's lives. It was a very tragic situation. You had a car, it was a Curlew in US 19, and you had a car that was going westbound, hit another car, swerved because there was an ambulance that was running lights and siren, and the particular car in question here was coming west, and when it was hit by another car, it flipped to go back, was coming east. It flipped around, so it was going west against traffic. So Deputy Sibley was coming east on Curlew, and then this car was coming west. And of course, there was cars behind him, so he intentionally put his car into that car to stop it before it could hurt somebody else. And you can have some head-on collisions, and certainly somebody's life could have been lost, and you could have had some real serious injuries. So, Deputy Sibley did a great job and very quick thinking on his part. Travis is a good guy. He's a good cop. He does a good job for us. He's in a community policing unit up in the north end. But these things happen so fast, and the fact that he was able to use his experience, his training, and his instincts, and be able to stop that car, like I said, at least arguably, he saved people from getting hurt and may have saved some people from getting killed. So he did a great job.
Guess what was bizarre about that? I looked at the video, and it looked as if the person who was trying to drive away that he had run into was hit.
Yeah.
That they had the right of way. It was kind of strange the person getting hit when trying.
Well, that's a complicated wreck, and there were at least 4, if not 5, cars involved in it. So you had the original ambulance, and then you had another car that swerved because of the ambulance, hit another car go southbound, and then you had at least, I think, 2 more cars involved in it. So it's a very, very complicated chain of events, and if I sit here and try and explain it to you without a map, nobody's going to understand it, and I'll twist it all around because but I'm aware of it, I read it, and because it is very complicated, and you had people going eastbound and westbound, and then that one car, they got hit and got pushed into the southbound lanes. But as this particular car that Deputy Sibley was able to stop, this car was going eastbound on Curlew and was hit by another car and spun coming back westbound as Deputy Sibley's coming eastbound. And so it's coming back against traffic on the wrong side. And of course, you had all these cars back here, and as that car is going, that's where you could have had a really catastrophic situation if he hadn't stopped that car. So we're thankful that he was there and he had the forethought and the training, experience, et cetera, to be able to stop that car. So.
Yeah, spell his full name.
What's that?
Spell his full name.
Travis Sibley, S-I-B-L-E-Y.
It looked as if the car, and I talked to Corporal Masaki about this, but it looked as if the car that was coming towards the deputy may have accidentally hit the gas versus the brake, which is so scary.
Yeah, scary, yeah.
Because I know in that moment, obviously, she was probably just freaking out.
Sure, because she got hit too. So I'm sure, you know, and you don't know whether her foot got caught or stuck or what happened in there, so you really don't know.
And you kind of mentioned the quick thinking that Deputy Sibley had. I mean, it's quick thinking, and he also put his own life at risk there. So can you kind of just talk a little bit about it?
Sure, but that's what cops do, and kind of, it's a very different situation. But remember, Deputy John Cotfilia from the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office over on the Selman, a couple years ago, and that wrong way driver, and he ended up losing his life to save other lives. So, very tough, but that's what cops do, and that's what their training is, and instincts kick in. And luckily, he also had a vehicle that was, a police vehicle that's equipped and has a push bumper on it, has those things, and is big enough to be able to stop it too. So you got to put it all together. But no question, Travis did a great job.
You don't have any charges or anything in that case?
As far as I know, there aren't any. No, it's purely an accident in that. So the last thing, and so you had 5, so I had a 6th one too. You guys can get this here in a second. Is Sergeant Gross will give it to you. Remember, if you all remember, we had a shooting. I think it was August 3rd in Safety Harbor. The deputies unfortunately had to shoot and kill a guy who took a shotgun and was going to shoot them. The state attorney's office, we have the letter today, and we're going to release it here shortly. The state attorney's office issued a determination as to those 3 deputies, and it's justifiable homicide. So the state attorney has cleared them. Sergeant Gross has a copy of the letter. We'll get it out here shortly, so that'll be coming out.
6th thing.
Yeah.
No,
We're 7 now.
Tarpon Springs.
Yeah.
Officer says he wants to be part of your task force or whatever, and threatens to do something horrible if not. Had he applied? Was he connected to the sheriff's office in any way?
No. I talked to Chief Cochin about that, and I'm aware of it. He's a Tarpon Springs police officer who had applied and I guess didn't get it and made comments about shooting the place up and shooting people. And I talked to Chief Cochin about it as they were working through that. They put him on administrative leave a couple months ago. I was aware of it. But he never worked for us. He was never assigned. I really have no knowledge of it other than what my discussions were with Chief Cochin about it existed and how they were dealing with it. So I really can't give you any specifics of that.
But he did apply.
He didn't apply. See, what happens is that for our narcotics division, and we do have in the task force, we do have officers from the police departments and from other agencies that participate, but they don't apply to us. Is that when there's an agency that participates, they select the officer who they assign. So we don't even get involved in that. Is that when we have an opening, so the application would have been internally at the Tarpon Springs Police Department. Then they would go through whatever selection process, and they would notify us. And so I wasn't even aware of it until after the fact. And so it really doesn't even involve us other than when they are actually assigned. And he was never actually assigned. All right, we done?
Did we get our story quota for the year now?
Yeah, we won't see you for a couple months.
Yeah, exactly. All right, you guys have a good weekend.
Thanks, Sheriff.